Thanks everybody for coming to our third Historic Preservation and Archaeology Brown Bag. This week we have on our docket the one and only Laurie Bryant, retired BLM paleontologist, now full-time pain in the butt.
Yes.
She now volunteers with our library collections folk, helping in the basement on some of their projects. And she's just an overall good partner to state history. And so we're thrilled to have her talk about her most recent venture into historic research, which has been done in a book at the University of Utah.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to jump right in. I'm calling this talk Lost and Found, the First Salt Lake City. You might ask, what was the first Salt Lake City? Well, it was called Great Salt Lake City because the lake already had a name, and so they just borrowed it. But how did it become a city? If you've got a bunch of pioneers in wagons coming here, how do they turn this into a city, an absolutely uninhabited place? It was Zion. The LDS Church and followers came here to create their Zion, their place. And they succeeded. But I'd be very much surprised if one person in 10,000 realized that it was built almost entirely of adobe bricks. You can't see this, so I'm going to read it to you. This was a map created by David Burr, who was the Territory of Utah surveyor, drawn in 1855. The legend says there were near 1,250 houses, all of them built of adobes. There were big ones, there were little ones, 2 rooms, or 10. This was a community with a building material in common. And I stress the word community because the pioneers were linked not only by their religion, but by their building material. The pioneers brought their architecture with them. They didn't bring their building materials much, but they brought their architecture. Most of the pioneers were from the East and the Midwest, and that's the architecture they brought. The Mormon Battalion in 1847 had passed through pueblos and towns in the Southwest where most buildings were built of adobe. But that was an entirely different style. Buildings like this spoke of home to the pioneers. People were accustomed to their life that they'd had within a familiar layout of rooms, of doors and windows in the same place, where they could cook and eat and sleep and work as they'd been accustomed to for decades, if not a couple hundred years, as they always had. Building here was a challenge. You're west of the Continental Divide. There are no large, slow-moving rivers. There's no canals, no railroads, nothing that could help you transport materials for building. Firing bricks, if they wanted to fire clay bricks, meant that they needed large amounts of timber or coal to fire the kilns. And that was a problem. The sources of timber were way up there. Early on, there was some timber up here in what was called North Canyon, near Bountiful. But I think that was pretty quickly depleted. Stone. Stone was the same problem. Good building stone was a long ways away. Again, in the Wasatch, north of here, I'm not even sure there was any good stone. But every creek, once you get down onto the flatter lands near the lake, every creek had a floodplain that was full of mud. So you combine the skills and the knowledge of the Mormon Battalion, who knew what pueblos looked like, who knew what adobe bricks were, with the architecture of people from the East, and you get adobe houses. The earliest, one of the earliest, and the largest adobe yard was just a few blocks from where we're sitting. we're actually sitting in the floodplain of Parley's Creek. So I get a little concerned, if there's even a tiny earthquake, this whole building's going to rock and roll. However, there were other small adobe yards and other places around the city. Many of them dug just for the purpose of building one or a few houses, and it worked. Some adobe buildings were simply huge. This is the old tithing office and Deseret store that was built when, Randy? 1850. 2.5 stories, the tallest adobe building in Salt Lake City. Really pretty much of a marvel. But adobe bricks are tougher than you might think. They're easy to transport. You can load a few on a wagon or load it up. You can go with however many you need or want or have time for. They could form impressive buildings. This building was part of the first Salt Lake City, but it was replaced by the Hotel Utah in 1911. Here's another great big adobe building, the Salt Lake Theater. Yes, it was partly rock. The lower story was mostly rock, but there was also a lot of adobe in there, the upper floors. This thing was 80 by 144 feet. Really quite an amazing piece of work for the time. Begun in 1861, finished in 1862. There were big houses, too. This one was begun in 1852 by Lorenzo Snow. It had a cupola, which was timber and frame. And it was purchased by Hiram Clausen about 1855, and he added the north and south wings. Quite an amazing house. And little ones. This is one of my favorites. This one is out on 300 North, just west of what had been, or what later was, the Denver and Rio Grande Western tracks. In its current condition, it's completely camouflaged. Originally, I want to thank Ken Williams for this lovely historic photo. Originally, it was uncoated and somehow managed to survive at least 50 years without a stucco coating. Somebody took good care of it. It was high enough up off the ground so the adobes didn't get wet. It was quite the house, and it still is. I've been inside. Actually, I've been inside a lot of adobe houses because you can just walk up the front walk and knock on the door. And people do let you in. It's a lot of fun. This is one of the little ordinary ones, and most of the ones that survive today are the little ordinary ones. The rear kitchen, the rear room there that you can see, was added to the original house. It wasn't part of it. Just about this time, 1854, the city council passed an ordinance prohibiting the use of these big bricks. These are probably the 12 by 18 by 6, and reducing the size of bricks that were allowed to 12 by 6 by 4. I think there had been some problems with the really large bricks, with their maintenance. No, I don't know that. And then you just never know where you're going to see them. If you can think of where this block is, it's a little bit southwest of the Smith's Marketplace on 400 South. The photograph on the lower left is a hair salon. There's a sign out front that says it was built in 1898. No, it was built in 1867. Alan and I have been in the cellar, and we saw at least one floor timber, that joist that had been burned. There were marks of hand tools and big square nails. That was very cool. The little one on the right is even more obscure. That one is on 600 East. And the whole block, all the lots were distributed to a family of blacksmiths named Pendleton. So the Pendletons and their children in-law occupied the whole block, and every house on it was adobe. Here's another one. You may know that Joseph Ridges built the first organ for the tabernacle. All the pipes, everything. This is the home of his son. Joseph's home is long gone. It's somewhere under the interstate. But Alfred's house is still here. It's just that it's completely camouflaged with siding and additions and vegetation, so you would never know. I had a heck of a time finding this one. I really did. And my favorite surprise, this was I think, my discovery. This is the home, the childhood home of the pioneer photographer George Edward Anderson. It's on 3rd Avenue. The small, actually it's a pretty large room, the room in the front, that was the original. And then about 1871, the 1.5-story addition was built. The windows in that addition are newer than the original building. But I've been in this one too. It's got wonderful newel posts and stair railings that are original to the house, about 1871. Apparently it wasn't a happy childhood. Anderson never wrote anything about it. But you can look at the records in the archives and find out that his father was charged and convicted for attacking Ed's mother with a knife, for throwing his children out in the snow, and on and on. And finally they divorced. I think things got a little more peaceful after that. Anyway, quite a story. But most of them just look like houses, any old house. The little cross wing, the one on the lower right, which I dearly love, actually faces Westminster College. It's on 1700 South. And the owner farmed half the block. That was his farm. What I like to do is drive around Salt Lake City and see what used to be there. I don't see houses and condos and business blocks. I see farms and tiny houses. The builder of the little greenhouse had his real house up in the avenues. He was related to a couple of other families who lived up there. They were all English. And his aunt, here's a gory story for you. His aunt certainly had mental problems. She was in the city's insane asylum when it burned, and she burned to death. No one ever mentions her in their diaries, stories, notes. And these two, here's another couple of my favorites. These are Adobe houses. They were built in 1890 by a couple of brothers up on 6th Avenue. If you visually strip the siding and the other junk off the house on the right, you can see that they're mirror images. I haven't been in these, oddly enough, but 1890, people were still building full throttle with Adobe. Why? Because it was cheap. It was easy and it was cheap. If you didn't have money, that's what you used. And frankly, that's why most of the Adobes that survive in Salt Lake City are small, because people could afford them and they had no reason or no means to tear them down and replace them. So they're still here. What we don't have is the big ones. Those are gone. However, stay tuned. There's a forthcoming work on the big ones in the works. The city banned the use of Adobe as the outer course in construction in 1904. So that was the end of that. There's some others that you probably have seen but didn't know you were looking at. Have you been to the Avenues Pet Clinic? It's on 100 South. There's the front. If you go down the alley on the west side, you can see the gable end of the original house built in 1874 by the Attorney General of Utah, Zerubbabel Snow. He and his wife Mary lived there. I've been in that one too. And then there's this 1920s apartment building. It's on 600 East, right near the corner of 100 South. All you have to do is go down the little space between it and the house to the north, and you can see the gable end. Both George and Annie Brooks were English immigrants. They came to the United States in the 1850s using a loan from the Perpetual Emigrating Fund, which means that they had nothing. They didn't have enough money to pay their own way, but they really wanted to come. So they borrowed this money, got a loan. In 1860, George was a common laborer down in Moroni. But by the time he built this house, he was a clerk in a store, which is a huge leap forward. Ultimately, he opened his own grocery store, Brooks and Sons, and did a land office business. So there's a success story that wasn't all that common among the earliest pioneers. Second generation, yes. First generation, it was tough. And here's what happens when they're not maintained. The little house on the upper left has been in the same family or owned by a family friend since it was built. It's a great little house. It's entirely covered with wood siding that was put on by the original owner, by the builder. It's got wonderful scroll work, but it's now overgrown. Clip the photo so that the trash cans and the other junk in the front don't show, but it's in very sad shape. If you look at the assessor's webpage, you can see that the structure itself is now worth only $1,600. This on Capitol Hill, where property goes for a fortune. The little house on the lower right is on 300 North, right next door to the home of Edwin Beasley, who was the choir master of the Tabernacle Choir. But it's in terrible disrepair. It's empty. No one's lived there since I've been looking at it, which is now about 7 years. And it's coming apart. That was Fred Slater's house. Fred was a shoemaker and probably not LDS. He died at St. Mark's Hospital, which is kind of a clue that he wasn't at one of the LDS hospitals. After he died, students at a school for undertakers used his body to study the placement of a corpse in a coffin. That's how he ended up. Unfortunately, demolition started very early, even of houses that were large and prominent and in excellent shape. They came down because progress. That's a familiar story. We all know that one. This particular house, this was Edward Hunter's house on Main Street, or what became Main Street. It was East Temple, became Main Street. And it was at the north end of what was becoming the commercial district. So off with its head. Another one. This was on 600 West. I watched its demolition in 2013 because I couldn't stand not to. You can, unfortunately, see a lot of detail, get a lot of information from a house as it's being demolished. You can see things like woodwork, fastenings, the way the bricks are laid, because there are standard brick patterns. You can see all kinds of things. The history on this house says that Octave Ursenbach and his wife raised silkworms in this house during the period when Brigham Young was strongly advising that home industry be a major influence on what went on in Salt Lake City. Not wanting to bring in, to import stuff from the East and pay those prices, and especially pay those prices to non-LDS merchants. There was a tremendous influence on home manufacture. And this is the place, one of a couple of places, where the silkworm industry began and then spread out from here. This house was built, actually there were 5 houses on this block, all Adobe, all built before 1870, all demolished. I'm ranting here, I know you can tell. This is another one. This was my favorite. This was a gorgeous I-house, central passage that faced south instead of facing the street. Built about 1868, right on the banks of City Creek. This is 50 North, 600 West. City Creek flowed just behind the house until it was put in a culvert and hidden from sight. But if you remember the floods of '83, things were pretty interesting out there because City Creek didn't want to be put back underground. It didn't want to be underground. It wanted to be back daylighted again. And it also flowed down State Street. That was another one of its original courses. If you remember the wooden bridges over State Street, I do. I know it's early. We can go back if you're interested. But I threw this in from a book I just finished reading. I'm sure you can read this. Buildings very seldom lie about their past. They don't make stuff up and tell it to you. It's right in there. And if you look carefully and you know something about how they're built and who built them, you can hear the story. I'm hoping that in the near future we can do something to prevent the demolition of more Adobe houses and more of the story of the first Salt Lake before their physical presence is gone. So thank you to all these nice people who've been helpful for years and years and years. And that's all I got to say. Thank you. Questions?
Laurie, how did you find the houses? Did you just drive around Salt Lake and say, hey, there's one? Did you look at maps?
I started with the Sanborn fire insurance maps. The Sanborn fire insurance maps, if you haven't used them, are wonderful creatures that were drawn beginning here in 1884 to identify the makeup of buildings so that fire insurance companies could decide how much they wanted to charge for fire insurance or whether they wanted to insure that building at all. A frame building clearly is going to burn much faster and more readily than a brick building. So that was important to fire insurance companies. Good on them. They color-coded every building. Red or pink for brick, blue for stone, yellow for frame, wood frame, and brown for Adobe. There it was. So the first task was to look at the most recent couple of editions of the Sanborn maps. I generally looked at the 1898 and the 1950. And that way I identified where somebody thought all the Adobe houses were. Then I looked at Google Maps to see if a building resembling the house on the map still existed, or whether it had been leveled or replaced or whatever. Then I drove around town to see what was there and to use some really sort of arcane ways of identifying Adobe houses. The easiest one of which is to look at the door frame and the window frames and see if they're 15 inches deep, more or less. If they are, it could be an Adobe. And that's where you knock on the door. That was fun. I liked it because most of the people who owned Adobe houses knew they were Adobe. Almost everyone knew that. Yeah, Susan.
The ones on 600 West, the 5 Adobe houses that
Yes.
were torn down, what's there now and what was the rationale for the destruction? Those look like sturdy, large houses.
That one, the I house, was a big house. The other 4 were smaller. Most of them were, a T-plan, or there was one that was a hall parlor with extensions. They were outside any of the city's historic districts. And their owner, the woman who owned that whole row, didn't know what they were. Somebody made her a nice offer, and what's there now is a multi-use, multi-story building that looks modern. I don't have too much use for modern architecture. Sorry. Yes?
How did you get started in this obsession again?
See him? See that guy sitting over there? Yes, it was. It was you. I've always liked old houses. I have a family full of old houses. The oldest family house that I know about in this country was built in 1685. It's still standing in Connecticut. And my grandparents had old houses where I visited as a child. And so that was an easy thing for me. When I moved here in 2000, and I had some spare time, I would drive up and down the streets and look at the cool houses. And I saw one on Harvard Avenue at 11th East, almost 11th East. And I looked it up in the files upstairs, and it turned out Alan was the one who did the windshield survey. And he said, "That's an Adobe. I'm a California girl. When you say Adobe to me, it has a whole different meaning from what's here in Salt Lake." But I was, wow. And that was the beginning of the end. Yeah. Here I am. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I wondered about the farmhouse, the Woodruff farmhouse on 50th.
Mm-hmm.
What do you know about it?
It's
Is it
log.
Adobe?
It's log.
It's log
Yeah.
underneath
I
that.
think it's about 1859, and it's log. There is a little bit of Adobe work that you can see when you're inside. Been in that one too.
So it's hard to tell just by salt box frames,
No.
even though they have that white kind of stucco thing over the top of them.
Most of the Adobes in Salt Lake have been stuccoed, sided, or something. So it's really hard to tell if you're looking at the exterior.
Just wondering if you quantified the remaining Adobe houses, and if you quantified the remaining houses in Salt Lake, and if you had a comparable number, how many there once were?
I don't know how many there once were. By the time you get the first Sanborn Map, it's 1884, and there have already been a lot of, well, there have been some demolitions and a lot of replacements, and the 1884 doesn't cover very much ground. It's pretty limited to downtown. I'm sorry, what was the second half? Oh, I did quantify them, yes. There were 201 until the 8 that have been demolished recently went down. So we're down to 193.
So you said there were some examples of 12 by 18 bricks. Did you ever actually see those, or did you just read about that?
I have never seen them because that little house on 300 North is so covered with probably a coat of stucco and now siding, and you can't see them from inside. But what I did was to look at that photograph and do kind of a comparable measurement of the women's hands. I know they were smaller than we are, but looking at the women's hands for a sort of comparative basis, and then looking at those bricks, and they're huge. So that's my guess. Yeah.
Laurie, what do the Adobe bricks themselves tell you? What do the Adobe bricks themselves tell you?
Oh, well, sometimes there's handprints on them. They have vegetable matter, which was part of what held them together, the binder. I think if a study were made, we could tell what was growing in the floodplains, get a good botanical study going. Pollen, I'm sure there's pollen in there. We could tell what was growing upstream as well as around them, the adobe yards. And I've seen some, in fact, the oldest house in Salt Lake City, where, again, a guided tour from Alan, In the attic, if you're allowed to go up in the attic and look at the walls, they're exposed. The sides, all you can see is the sides of the adobe bricks. They are so smooth, you can see the marks of the mold that the brick made as it was tipped out. That's just, yeah.
You mentioned in 1904 that the city outlawed Adobe for the outer life of structures. In your research, did they give any rationale or reason for that?
I have never found a reason. And believe me, I looked. It may have been, we were just coming out of the progressive era, still somewhat in it, and it may have been the notion that that's not cool. That's old-fashioned. Let's not do it anymore. We're better than that. I don't know. Yeah.
When you say they were cheap, did people make their own? Were there places they could go where there was available mud? Or did they have to buy them? Or how would you make your own, and where would you go to find the kind of mud that they used?
Well, the pioneers started using Adobe in their fort at what's now Pioneer Park. Because here we are in the floodplain of Parley's Creek. There was an endless amount of exposure of mud. You could buy them if you had money, and there was a core of people who had money. You could make them yourself. There's a wonderful quote in my book about a man who took the end gate off his wagon and made it into adobe molds, and then went to the adobe yard and made his own. Oh yes, the adobe yard was right over here, right under the interstate. Mm-hmm.
And it was free? People could go there?
I don't know what the charge was or whether it was variable, and whether it changed over time. That I don't know. I have limits. Serious limits.
What was the drying time on an Adobe brick, do you know? The drying time on an Adobe brick.
I'm sure it depended on the weather.
Yeah, I guess so.
I know someone who insists that they couldn't be dried in the sun, that they would dry too fast and maybe crack. But we didn't have a lot of shade. So I think they were dried wherever you could get space to lay them out. And I don't know how long it took to dry them. I do know that they were dried to a point and then tipped out of the molds, so they could complete their drying just without the mold, and the mold could then be used again.
I've seen at the Old Mormon Fort in Las Vegas, they have an interactive place with Adobe molds.
When I was a little girl in grade school in California, we made Adobes, because in 3rd grade we studied the missions, and we made Adobes in molds.
And see the outcome?
We weren't allowed to build anything. I don't remember that. All righty. Thank you very, very much.